1881, a cowboy walked into the Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City and ordered a plate of son-of-a-gun stew. The main ingredient was the still warm intestines of a freshly killed calf. He ate every bite, soaked up the gravy with stale bread, and went back to work. That was lunch. The Wild West Saloon was not some glamorous barroom from a Hollywood movie. It was a greasy, smoke-filled room where men ate organs, drank coffee thick as axle grease, and washed it all down with whiskey that could strip paint. Number 14 on this list was so disturbing that polite society refused to print the recipe, and number 3 was served at nearly every saloon on the frontier. But if you knew what was in it, you would never touch a hot dog again. Before we start, hit subscribe, because this list gets wilder with every entry. Number 25, hardtack and coffee. Before a cowboy ever set foot in a saloon, he lived on hardtack. These dense flour and water crackers, baked until bone dry, were issued by the military during the Civil War and became trail food for every cattle driver heading west. A single cracker could survive years without spoiling. That was the selling point. The taste was closer to chewing a wooden shingle than eating bread. Cowboys called them sheet iron, jawbreakers, and worm castles, because after a few months in a saddlebag, weevils burrowed inside. The standard trick was to soak the cracker in boiling coffee until it softened enough to chew without cracking a tooth. Some men crumbled it into bacon grease and fried the mess into a thick, greasy porridge. A box of hardtack cost about $1 in 1870 and could keep a man alive for weeks on the trail. It was not food you enjoyed. It was food you survived on until you reached a town with a saloon that served something hot. Number 24, Sobelly and biscuits. Sobelly was salt pork cut from the belly of the hog, cured in brine until it could last months without refrigeration. Every chuck wagon carried a barrel of it. The cook would slice it thick, fry it in a cast iron skillet over a mesquite fire, and serve it alongside sourdough biscuits so dense they could double as paperweights. The fat that rendered off the sowbelly went into everything else: beans, gravy, even the biscuit dough. A pound of salt pork cost about 12 cents in 1875, making it the cheapest protein on the frontier. Cowboys ate it 3 times a day on long cattle drives: breakfast, dinner, and supper. The same slab of pork, the same heavy biscuits. After 6 weeks on the trail, men would ride an extra 20 miles just to reach a saloon that served something, anything that was not Sobelly. Number 23, chuck wagon beans. No single food defined the cowboy diet more than beans. Pintos mostly were cooked slowly in a cast iron Dutch oven buried in coals. The chuck wagon cook, often the most important man on the cattle drive, would soak dried beans overnight, then stew them with salt pork, onions, and molasses for 6 to 8 hours. A 50-pound sack of dried pinto beans cost $2 in 1878 and could feed a crew of 12 for a month. The beans bubbled and popped over the fire, filling the camp with a thick, sweet, smoky smell that carried across the prairie. Cowboys called them prairie strawberries, Pecos strawberries, or simply whistleberries, for the obvious reason. When a trail hand finally reached a saloon in Abilene or Dodge City, he was so sick of beans he would order anything else on the board. But more often than not, the saloon served beans too, just with a shot of whiskey on the side. Number 22, spotted pup. This was the cowboy's version of dessert on the trail, and it showed up on saloon menus from Tombstone to Deadwood. Rice boiled with raisins and sweetened with brown sugar or molasses. That was the whole recipe. The cook would simmer it in whatever pot was clean, stirring until the raisins plumped and the rice turned sticky and sweet. The dark raisins dotting the white rice gave it its name. It looked like a spotted dog. A cup of spotted pup after a week of beans and salt pork was the closest thing to luxury a cowboy knew. Some saloons dressed it up with canned milk or a splash of whiskey. trail cooks who made a good spotted pup earned loyalty from their crews that no amount of wages could buy. Number 21. Vinegar pie. When fresh fruit was 100 miles away and eggs cost 50 cents each, frontier women invented vinegar pie. A splash of apple cider vinegar, sugar, butter, flour, and 1 or 2 eggs baked in a lard crust. The vinegar mimicked the tartness of lemon, creating a filling that tasted surprisingly close to lemon meringue without a single lemon in sight. Saloons in Kansas cattle towns served slices for a nickel alongside plates of roast beef and bread. Cowboys who had not tasted anything sweet in weeks would pay double. The recipe passed from covered wagon to ranch kitchen to saloon counter, proof that frontier cooks could conjure something worth eating from almost nothing. Number 20. Pickled eggs. Every saloon worth its whiskey kept a jar of pickled eggs on the bar. Hard-boiled eggs, submerged in vinegar, salt, and beet juice, sat in cloudy glass jars for weeks, turning a deep reddish purple. They cost a penny each and were eaten whole, sometimes in a single bite between hands of poker. The vinegar preserved them without refrigeration in towns where summer temperatures hit 110 degrees. In Dodge City, the Long Branch kept 3 jars going at all times. Pickled eggs were bar food before bar food existed. Salty, sour, and cheap enough that even a cowboy who had blown his pay at the faro table could still eat something before riding out. Number 19. Canned peaches. In the 1870s, canned fruit was a luxury on the frontier. A single tin of peaches cost as much as 75 cents, nearly a full day's wages for a ranch hand. But when a cowboy walked into a saloon and saw canned peaches on the menu, he would spend the money without blinking. The syrup was thick and golden. The fruit was soft and sweet, a shock to a palate that had known nothing but salt, grease, and grit for months. Saloons in mining towns like Virginia City and Leadville charged even more, knowing that men pulling silver from the earth would pay anything for a taste of civilization. Empty peach tins littered the landscape of the West. Archaeologists still dig them up at old campsites. That tin can was proof that someone had experienced, however briefly, something sweet. Number 18. Son of a gun stew. First pattern break. Here is where the list gets uncomfortable. Son of a gun stew was the signature dish of the cattle drive, and its ingredients would make a modern grocery shopper walk straight out the door. When a calf was butchered on the trail, the cook used everything: heart, liver, tongue, kidneys, sweetbreads, and the prize ingredient, marrow gut, the tube connecting the 2 stomachs of a calf, still filled with partially digested milk. That marrow gut gave the stew its distinctive rich, creamy texture. The whole mess simmered for hours in a Dutch oven. Cowboys who ate it swore by it. The name itself was a polite version. The original term used a word no polite publication would print, earning the stew its unofficial title that started with the letters S-O-B. Despite its alarming ingredients, Son of a Gun stew was one of the most nutritious meals on the frontier. Organ meats provided iron, vitamins, and fat that kept men working 18-hour days in brutal heat. A trail boss who hired a cook that could not make a proper son of a gun stew would lose his best hands by week 2. Number 17. Rocky Mountain oysters. They were not oysters. They were calf testicles, sliced, breaded in flour and cornmeal, and fried in lard until golden and crispy. Ranchers castrated young bulls every spring, and the byproduct went straight into the skillet. Saloons in Denver, Cheyenne, and cattle towns across the plains served them as a delicacy, sometimes listed on the menu as prairie oysters or cowboy caviar. The taste was mild, almost like a tender piece of veal, and the texture was creamy inside the crunchy shell. A plate cost 15 cents in the 1880s. Cowboys who had done the castrating that morning ate them without flinching. Newcomers asked what they were, took one bite, and either became lifelong fans or pushed the plate away in horror. There was no middle ground. Number 16. Bone marrow on toast. Buffalo hunters and frontier scouts cracked open leg bones and roasted the marrow over open fires, spreading the hot, buttery fat on whatever bread was available. In saloons, the cook would roast beef or bison bones in the oven, split them lengthwise, and serve the marrow on thick slices of bread with salt and pepper. The marrow was rich, fatty, and almost sweet, with a texture like warm butter. It was the fuel that kept men riding through Dakota blizzards and Arizona heat. A single bone cost almost nothing, the cheapest cut the butcher had, but the marrow inside was calorie-dense enough to sustain a man for hours. Modern chefs charged $20 for roasted bone marrow at upscale restaurants. In 1875, it was what you ate when you could not afford anything else. Number 15. Rattlesnake. In the desert Southwest, rattlesnake meat was not exotic. It was Tuesday dinner. Cowboys killed rattlers on the trail out of necessity, and the practical ones ate what they killed. The meat was stripped from the spine, cut into sections, and fried in bacon grease or roasted over mesquite coals. The flavor was lean, slightly gamey, and closer to frog legs than chicken, despite what every old-timer claimed. Some saloons in Arizona and New Mexico served fried rattlesnake as a novelty, charging miners and travelers a premium for the thrill of eating something dangerous. A whole rattlesnake could feed 2 men. The skin was kept for hatbands or boot decoration. Nothing wasted. Number 14. Brains and eggs. Second pattern break. This is the one that makes people stop chewing. Calf brains scrambled with eggs was a common breakfast in frontier saloons and ranch kitchens from Texas to Montana. The cook would soak the brains in cold water to firm them, remove the membrane, then chop them into soft, pale chunks and scramble them with eggs in a cast iron pan. The texture was custard-like, rich and creamy, blending almost invisibly into the eggs. A serving cost about 10 cents in the 1880s. Cowboys ate it without thinking twice. Brains were cheap, available whenever an animal was slaughtered, and packed with fat and calories. The dish survived well into the 20th century in parts of the rural South and Midwest. But the fear of prion diseases in the 1990s finally killed what the frontier never could. For 100 years, brains and eggs was just breakfast. Number 13. Bear steak. In the mountain territories, bear meat was more common than beef. Hunters and trappers brought black bear into mining camps and frontier towns, where saloon cooks served it as steaks, roasts, or stewed with wild onions and root vegetables. The meat was dark, dense, and powerfully flavored, with a taste that depended entirely on what the bear had been eating. A berry-fed bear tasted almost sweet. A fish-fed bear tasted like the river. Saloons in Colorado and Montana territories listed bear on their menus alongside elk, venison, and antelope. A bear steak dinner cost about 25 cents. The fat was rendered and saved for cooking and waterproofing leather. Number 12. Red-eye gravy. This was not gravy in any modern sense. A cowboy or saloon cook would fry a slab of country ham, then deglaze the crusty blackened pan with strong black coffee. The mixture sizzled and reduced into a thin, dark, intensely salty sauce with a reddish tint, earning its name from the color. Some versions used a splash of whiskey instead of coffee. It was poured over biscuits, grits, or whatever bread was at hand. It was the taste of morning on the frontier. Bitter, salty, smoky, and strong enough to wake the dead. The recipe cost nothing beyond the ham and the coffee that were already being made. It was pure frontier economy, turning pan drippings into a meal. Number 11. Jerky. Dried meat was the original survival food of the American West. Cowboys, soldiers, and lawmen carried strips of beef, buffalo, or venison, dried in the sun or over slow smoke until stiff as leather. A pound of jerky represented 5 or 6 pounds of fresh meat, concentrated into something that fit in a saddlebag and lasted for months. The chewing was relentless. A single strip could take 20 minutes to work through. But the salt and protein kept men moving across empty plains where the next meal might be 2 days away. Saloons sold jerky by the strip for a penny or two, kept in baskets on the bar next to the pickled eggs. It was not a meal anyone craved. It was a meal that kept you alive. Number 10. Free lunch counter spread. Third pattern break. Here is a secret most people never learned about Wild West saloons. Many of them offered a free lunch, not out of charity, but as a business strategy. Buy a 5-cent beer, and you had access to a counter loaded with bread, cold meats, pickles, cheese, hard-boiled eggs, sardines, and sometimes roast beef or baked beans. The catch was simple. The food was heavily salted, and salty food made men thirsty, and thirsty men bought more beer. Saloon owners calculated that the food cost about 2 cents per customer, while the extra drinks brought in 10 times that. The free lunch became so widespread in cattle towns and mining camps that politicians tried to ban it, claiming it encouraged drunkenness. By the 1890s, nearly every saloon in San Francisco, Denver, and Kansas City ran some version of the free lunch counter. The phrase there is no such thing as a free lunch was born right here in these smoky rooms where the beer was cheap and the food was a trap. Number 9. Chili con carne. Texas chili arrived in frontier saloons through the chili queens of San Antonio, women who set up portable stoves in the city plazas and served bowls of fiery beef stew to cowboys, soldiers, and gamblers. The original recipe used dried chili peppers, beef, or sometimes goat, suet, and cumin, cooked until the meat fell apart and the sauce turned thick and brick red. No beans, no tomatoes, just meat, fat, and fire. A bowl cost 5 cents in the 1880s. The chili queens became famous, drawing crowds from across Texas. When the dish traveled north into Kansas cattle towns, saloon cooks adapted it with whatever meat was available. Venison chili, buffalo chili, even jackrabbit chili appeared on frontier menus. The burn was the point. In towns where the water was questionable and the whiskey was worse, a bowl of chili killed whatever was living in your stomach. Number 8. Biscuits and sop. When there was nothing else, there were biscuits. Sourdough biscuits made from flour, lard, and a sourdough starter that the cook carried in a wooden crock like a living treasure. The starter was sometimes years old, passed from one trail cook to the next, fed and kept alive through blizzards and droughts. The biscuits baked in a Dutch oven came out golden, crusty, and steaming. Sop was whatever liquid was available to dip them in. Bacon grease, coffee, pot liquor from boiled greens, or gravy scraped from the bottom of the skillet. The biscuit was the fork, the plate, and the meal, all in one. A good sourdough starter was worth more to a chuck wagon cook than his saddle. Number 7. Elk steak. In the mountain territories of Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, elk was the beef of the high country. Saloons in towns like Bozeman and Helena served elk steaks grilled over open flames, the meat dark red and lean with a flavor richer and wilder than any domestic beef. A full elk could feed a saloon for a week. Hunters sold whole carcasses to saloon owners for a few dollars, making elk cheaper than cattle-raised beef in many frontier towns. The steaks were thick, served rare, and eaten with bread and whatever vegetables the season offered. For miners and lumbermen burning 6,000 calories a day, elk steak was not a luxury. It was fuel. Number 6. Sourdough flapjacks. Breakfast in every frontier saloon and cow camp started with flapjacks. The cook ladled sourdough batter onto a greased griddle, flipping the cakes when bubbles formed on the surface. They were served stacked high with molasses, bacon grease, or, if the saloon was well supplied, actual butter. A short stack cost a nickel. Cowboys ate 6, 8, sometimes 10 flapjacks at a sitting, loading up on calories before a day in the saddle. The sourdough gave them a tangy, complex flavor that modern pancake mix cannot touch. In Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush, sourdough flapjacks were so central to survival that prospectors were nicknamed sourdoughs. The starter was kept warm inside their shirts at night to keep the yeast alive in sub-zero temperatures. Number 5. Buffalo Hump Roast. Fourth pattern break. Before the Great Slaughter of the 1870s reduced the buffalo herds from 60 million to fewer than 1,000, buffalo meat was the most abundant protein on the Great Plains. The most prized cut was the hump. The fatty hump of muscle that rose behind the buffalo's massive head was roasted whole over open pits or in saloon ovens, and the meat was marbled, tender, and rich beyond anything domestic beef could offer. Mountain men and fur trappers considered hump meat the finest eating in North America. Saloons in early frontier towns like Leavenworth and St. Joseph served buffalo hump roast for 20 cents a plate. The fat that rendered off was saved for cooking, candles, and leather treatment. When the buffalo were nearly exterminated by commercial hide hunters, the hump roast vanished from American tables almost overnight. The taste of that lost abundance, a flavor that once fed entire nations, disappeared in less than a decade. Number 4. Hangtown. Fry. Legend places the origin in Placerville, California. During the gold rush, a miner who had just struck it rich walked into a saloon and demanded the most expensive meal they could make. The cook combined the 3 priciest ingredients in camp: eggs at $1 each, bacon at a premium, and oysters shipped on ice from San Francisco Bay. The result was a scramble of eggs, fried oysters, and bacon that became the signature dish of Gold Rush, California. A plate of Hangtown fry cost as much as $6 in the 1850s, a fortune when most men earned $1 a day. It was the meal that said you had made it. Miners who ordered Hangtown fry were buying status as much as supper. Number 3. Mystery meat sausages. Every saloon in every cattle town served sausages, and nobody asked what was in them. Butchers and saloon cooks ground whatever they had: beef scraps, pork trimmings, organ meat, and in lean times, horse, mule, or worse, stuffed into casings, seasoned with sage and pepper, and fried until the outside crackled. A link cost a penny or 2. Cowboys ate them by the fistful. The spices covered the flavor of meat that had been sitting in the heat too long. Health inspections did not exist. Refrigeration was decades away. These sausages were the direct ancestors of the American hot dog, born in an era when asking questions about your food was considered bad manners. Number 2. Steak so rare, it still mooed. In the great cattle towns of the 1870s and 1880s, beef was so abundant and so cheap that saloons served steaks the size of saddle leather. Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita sat at the end of the cattle trails, and freshly slaughtered beef cost next to nothing. A thick steak dinner with bread and coffee cost 25 cents. The meat was cooked over open flames, charred on the outside, running red in the middle. No sides to speak of, no vegetables, just a massive slab of beef on a tin plate, eaten with a knife and bare hands. Cowboys who had spent 3 months driving cattle 1,000 miles sat down to steaks that weighed over a pound. They ate in silence, fast and focused, knowing that this was the payoff for months of dust, danger, and beans. Number 1. Whiskey stew. At the top of this list sits the meal that defined the Wild West saloon itself. Whiskey stew was what the cook made when supplies were thin, tempers were short, and a room full of armed men needed feeding. Whatever meat was available, beef, venison, sometimes just bones, went into a pot with potatoes, onions, and a generous pour of frontier whiskey. The alcohol cooked off slowly, tenderizing the meat and adding a warm, smoky depth to the broth. A bowl cost a dime and came with all the bread you could eat. It was served in every saloon, from the Rio Grande to the Dakotas. The whiskey disguised bad meat, softened tough cuts, and gave the stew a warmth that no amount of salt or pepper could match. Lawmen ate it next to outlaws. Cattle barons sat beside drifters. Around the whiskey stew pot, the frontier was equal. Everyone was just hungry. These 25 meals tell the real story of the American West. Not the polished legend of Hollywood, but the gritty, greasy, desperate truth of feeding yourself on a frontier that offered nothing easily. From hardtack gnawed on dusty trails to buffalo hump roasts that vanished with the herds, every dish on this list was forged by necessity. Cowboys, lawmen, miners, and outlaws all sat at the same rough tables, eating whatever the cook could throw together, grateful for anything hot. The next time you fire up a grill or sit down at a restaurant, remember what a meal used to cost. Not in dollars, but in dust, danger, and days in the saddle. Tell me in the comments, which one of these would you actually try? And which one made you lose your appetite? Subscribe if you have not, because the next list is already coming.